next talk is by two researchers. The first of which is Natalie Kastel, who just finished her master's in brain and cognitive science at the University of Amsterdam, and Casper, who is a PhD student in social neuroscience at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Their presentation is entitled Ideas Worth Spreading, a Free Energy Proposal for Cumulative Cultural Dynamics, and I will let her take it away from here.
Okay, so if everybody can hear me and everything is good, then I'll just start. Hopefully you can see my screen. Let me just reset something. Okay. So my name is Natalie Kastel. Like she said, I finished my master's in brain and cognitive neuroscience at Amsterdam. And actually the work that I'm going to be presenting to you today is my master's thesis, which was supervised by Casper, called Ideas Worth Spreading, a Free Energy Proposal for Cumulative Cultural Dynamics. And in short, our project provides an active inference formalization and also some simulations of how a certain idea, or what we would refer to as a particular belief state, spreads in a population. Right. So during this talk, I'm going to be following a standard paper structure. So I'll start off by going over some of the current literature on cultural dynamics and evolution, as well as motivating the appeal to active inference for modeling this dynamic. And in the methods section, I'm gonna elaborate on the specific modeling framework we're gonna be using to include current frameworks that we build on. I'll also be going over the parameters of the generative model applied in our cultural simulations, followed by the results of these simulations. So for the discussion section, what I really hope I'm going to have time to do is open for discussion a possible theory that I had in mind, which was inspired by the results that I'm going to talk about. And hopefully you're going to be willing and interested to give me some feedback or talk about it. So finally, I'm going to finish with concluding thoughts. So first, for a little bit of background on what I mean by cultural dynamics and what dynamics exactly we're going to be focusing on for our agent-based simulations. So when I talk about cultural dynamics, what I'm referring to specifically is the diffusion and the evolution dynamics of cultural information, and how it affects a population, but from a systems perspective. So this process is typically divided into three components that usually they're studied separately, but here we sort of put them together. So first, novel cultural information is introduced into a population in a process that we know of as innovation. And secondly, a novel piece of cultural information then spreads in the population in a process that is known in the literature as cultural transmission. So I just want to mention, though, quickly, that an emerging conclusion from this talk is going to be that this term is kind of impoverished because it leaves out the retention of cultural information, which I'll argue later on is crucial for a complete understanding of the way information evolves in a population. So for this talk, I'll be referring to this process as the local dynamics or the communication dynamics of culture. Finally, cultural information spreads within a society, thereby shaping it to the degree to which the idea is prevalent. And this is going to be referred to as the global dynamics. So now I want to talk a little, just a second. רותי, אני שומעת את עצמי. Sorry for that. Okay. Oops. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about our focus in this project, which has been theorizing about and simulating the local and the global dynamics of cultural information spread. And we focus specifically on these two for two reasons. So first, we decided not to deal with the emergence of innovation or novel cultural information because there really aren't enough theoretical models to build on. And most of the literature focuses on like the spread of cultural information. But you can note that the emergence of innovation from a collective cultural brain is exactly what I want to be talking about when I theorize in the discussion. Another reason for our focus on the local dynamics of communication and the global dynamics is that while there's like a really fast growing body of theoretical and empirical research that's being done in this field, there's just not really enough mathematical models that are able to integrate these different approaches and this different information from multiple disciplines into a unified and a quantifiable interpretation. So this is why we chose to focus on offering a quantitative model of cultural dynamics, which we hope is going to achieve exactly that. So the purpose of this slide is to show that even those quantitative models that currently exist, even those are kind of insufficient because they don't quite capture the genuine complexities of cultural evolution. And a prominent stream where I think this occurs is inspired by epidemiology, where accounts convert models used for predicting the spread of a virus to describe the spread of an idea. You probably know this as memetics. And these models developed from earlier theories, which compared a cultural belief to a virus of the mind that propagates by infecting the minds of individuals within a society in much the same way that a biological virus infects immune systems. So this is all very cool, but there's one critical problem with this comparison, and that is that it implies that a cultural idea is just simply copied during transmission, just like viruses are copied. So we thought of this notion as just being kind of intuitively insufficient for any realistic portrayal of communication. But we also show in the paper that it also conflicts with many existing theoretical ideas on cultural transmission. And these theories that conflict with epidemiology models for cultural spread suggest that transmission actually involves the active interpretation of the person receiving the information, so that information can't just be merely copied during transmission. Mainly problematic, however, and this is the very point, is that epidemiology models are inconsistent with models of cumulative culture. Now, models of cumulative culture portray culture as the result of a process by which cultural traits are gradually modified and improved upon over many generations. And they conflict with epidemiology models because they suggest that culture is just the accumulation of changes to traits that occur with every transmission, such that information can't be thought of as just being merely copied under a cumulative framework. And theories on a dynamic cumulative culture are extremely prominent in the literature and are perhaps like the most representative, I think, of the genuine complexities of cultural evolution. But the problem is that this makes them also very challenging to formalize under like a mathematical account, and which is why this account is very useful and why active inference specifically is useful. So how did we deal with formalizing these complexities of a cumulative culture? Historically speaking, a particularly challenging element of modeling this cumulative culture is formalizing what kind of seems like an almost limitless appearance of cultural traits. Because if every transmission of information does involve changes to a trait, then there are countless ways in which these traits can be modified and then ultimately represented. So a useful way to tackle this problem has been conceptually thinking about cultural information as discrete units that start out simple, but over generations continuously rearrange and reshuffle. And in this process, they create a potentially boundless display of new and increasingly complex cultural bits of information. So this led us to the appeal to current models of cultural evolution that apply exactly this thinking, and these are known as population memetics models. Memetics models make this explicit analogy to genetic inheritance, where the fundamental unit of cultural inheritance is known as a cultural unit or a trait. So our model leaves this concept of a cultural trait abstract. But if we put it in a cultural context, it can take on the form of any relevant belief, fashion, ideology, preference, language, behavior. So this analogy to genes is useful from a modeling perspective because it highlights the importance of recombination for complex representation of cultural information that, much like genetic information, is constantly evolving. But the problem is that memetics model, even though they offer an elegant solution to modeling problems, they're pretty notorious, you maybe know, for having their own conceptual and methodological difficulty. So mostly we've realized these have to do with kind of legitimate, real differences between genetic and cultural inheritance that have been so far overlooked in models. So our intermediate aim really has been to tackle these problems using an active inference formulation. And we focus on two prominent ones. The first unaccounted for difference is between genetics and memetics is that genetic inheritance naturally offers a distinction between a genotype and a phenotype. So there's like a clear-cut division between the site carrying inherited cultural information and the site of the specific appearance of that information. But the problem is that current literature on cultural inheritance doesn't really offer this equivalent distinction between these two sites. And so this makes every attempt to formalize models of cultural evolution very prone to error. So this is the case because variation, which is represented in genetics as the genotype and in culture as the cultural unit. So variation and selection, which has no cultural equivalent, they have to be somehow distinguished in their state spaces to allow for the selection and further reproduction of culture. So the problem is that so far, population memetics models neglected this issue and left the question of the space of cultural selection untreated, such that cultural traits in these models occupy a kind of abstract and like a vague capacity. Another unaccounted for difference between memes and genes is that genes can be easily modeled as a recombination of sufficiently similar genotypes because they're based on a shared genome. But cultural ideas are subjective and they can be represented differently from person to person. And this difference hasn't been accounted for in other models between genes and memes, but active inference is actually kind of useful for solving this. In previous active inference work, this problem of discrete representations of meaning has actually been articulated as the problem of hermeneutics. For those of you who don't know, hermeneutics is the non-trivial notion that when we communicate, when we share, and when we transform information, we don't actually have any direct access to each other's internal representation of meaning. So even if we try really, really hard to interpret someone's true meaning with some convincing narrative that we have, we still wouldn't have any objective criteria with which we could verify our account. And the problem of hermeneutics, and this is detailed in Friston and Fritz's 2015 Duet for One, which is a crucial paper for this project, is solving for how, despite all I just said, we still see that we're able to understand each other and even relatively precisely. The solution for hermeneutics in active inference comes from the basic assumption that both communicating parties employ sufficiently similar generative model, even if their internal states can be very different. So when this is the case, and you should bear in mind that this is not always the case, interlocutors refer to their own internal generative model in order to infer the state of another from their behavior. And in our case, we use speech. So put more simply, shared generative model structures are used as a kind of frame of reference or a mental anchor for inferring the internal states of others. And importantly, active inference communication also provides us with a clue of how to solve the problem of the site of cultural selection. So still in Friston and Frith's 2015 Duet for One, they simulate active inference communication in birdsong. And then they show that when two agents or birds engage in communication, they become coupled in a cycle of action and perception, which ultimately brings about a generalized synchrony between their internal states. And this mutual attunement of agents to each other's states allows for a shared representations to emerge. And in this project, we want to build on this idea of shared representations as generalized synchrony. And we formalize an active inference consistent theory for the site of cultural selection. Under our model, when we simulate the belief updating dynamics between agents that are communicating, this recombination of two separate internal beliefs into one takes the form of a specific convergence between the respective generative model. So a byproduct of this thesis, of this convergence of belief states, which is the thesis, basically, a byproduct of this is that a reproduced cultural belief resides in the minds of both interlocutors as the site of cultural selection, where it can be further reproduced through the same process, basically. So what we see is that active inference allows us to formulate a consistent account of cultural information spread through communication by building on and improving population mimetic existing ideas. And we provide a proof of principle for this by simulating a dialogue between active inference agents, which hold distinct belief states, and they try to convince each other of their own belief. And the main agenda for these simulations is to provide a proof of principle for the idea that generalized synchrony between communicating agents can be operationalized as a particular convergence between their respective generative models. And that this operationalization helps us build the necessary methodological and conceptual building blocks for a full-blown model of cumulative culture. And again, as a reminder, cumulative culture is just the idea that culture is the accumulation of modifications to belief states. So in order to simulate this, we basically multiplied the local dynamics from the previous static simulation to 50 agents, such that instead of one couple in dialogue, there are 25 couples engaged in dialogue at each given time step. So I hope that was kind of clear. Basically, I'm supposed to be going over the generative model, but I've seen that I just don't have enough time at all. So this is it. And I can't go over it because then I just won't be able to finish. But basically, parameters are in squares, concentration parameters are in dark blue circles. And the way to understand it spatially is that from left to right is how states evolve in time, and bottom to top is how components of the generative model are hierarchically structured in alignment with cognitive functions. On the left, I describe all the parameters, and on the right, I describe the states that are relevant for each level. So we have the level of perception, the level of anticipation, where where agents anticipate how the belief state of the other might change over time. We have two actions, two sets of actions. One is meeting selection and one is belief expression. And we have a level of learning where, crucially, actually, the core belief states map onto either positive or to negative emotional valence states through a likelihood mapping A2. So that's all I'm gonna say for now. If you have questions about this, I'd be happy to answer later. This, I also just go over the parameters one by one. And here you see like the belief state. You have the red belief state, which is the status quo belief, and the blue belief state, which is the new or the novel belief state. But I can't really go over that either. And let me just see if there's anything. And this is, these sites hold all the action parameters, either responsible for habitual control or voluntary actions. And I do go over expected free energy and conformity bias, but maybe I'll just mention it. No, I think I will go over it later. Okay, so let's talk about the results of our local simulated dynamics of communication between active inference agents. Another quick reminder is that when two agents engage in communication, they are coupled in a bidirectional action and perception cycle, and they can be described basically as two coupled dynamical systems. And specifically, our model defines two groups of parameters that couple these internal states of agents. And one is explicit and one is more implicit. So the implicit one is the perceptual learning. But I'm also gonna jump over that for a second because it's not as important. The model convergence is more important, and this is the perceptual inference. It works on fast time scales, and it's responsible for agents' convergence of internal belief states during conversation. And this is regulated by agents' sensitivity to model evidence, which is the parameter A1. And this is direct and it's explicit to them during dialogue. And this is opposed to perceptual learning, which takes a lot of time. So this is the parameter A1 is the parameter that we're going to focus on for the simulation of model convergence, because without sufficient high precisions here, agents we're gonna show they're insensitive to evidence regarding the belief state of the other, so that this model convergence that we're talking about, it can't really occur. So that's exactly what we show here. Belief here is expressed on the y-axis, on the range of 0 to 1, and on the x-axis, we have time steps during agents' conversation. On the left, sensitivity to model evidence, or the A1 parameter, is low for both agents. And what we see is that this results in each agent kind of like sticking to their guns, so to speak, and not adhering or tuning to the belief expression of their partner. On the right, sensitivity to model evidence is sufficiently high, and we see that this results in the attunement of agents to each other's representations of a belief, and their beliefs really nicely converge into a shared representation of an idea. So note that I said that it needs to be sufficiently high. That is, it can't really be too high, because when we do that, then actually agents start to listen more to the other agent, which is weird and doesn't make any sense. So it's also important to understand that these simulations should be understood as taking generalized synchrony already for granted. So, because that's what Friston and Frith actually did in 2015. But our simulations build on that by providing evidence for the premise that the level to which agents' beliefs converge, or the level of synchrony between their internal states, is modulated by their sensitivity to model evidence. I kind of show a cool sort of characteristic of our model compared to other models, and that is that I show that it's kind of more flexible. So epidemiology models, for instance, they give away all the influence, all the dominance, let's say, the power to convince to the transmitting agent, because this agent just simply copies its belief onto the other agent. So, and on the other hand, population mimetic models, for instance, they give both agents this like convincing power, but only exactly half because they assume that cultural transmission is exactly comparable with the way genetics work, which doesn't leave room for a lot of flexibility. And here I show that our converged belief, like the end here, that can take on any value between 0 and 1. So this makes them way more, it makes them way more flexible. And this is due to the fact that they have, that there's a lot of parameters that are controlling who gets to sort of get the upper hand, let's say. Here on the left, you see that on the right, you see that the agent holding a blue belief is dominant. And on the left, the agent holding the pink is more dominant. And the ratio here is 80-20, but it could be really any ratio. And that's what's cool about this model. Okay, so summing up very quickly our results. By conceptually thinking about transmission as a bi-directional process, as opposed to a one-directional transmission, we conceptually improve on models like epidemiology that imply a view of the spread of cultural information that's not really consistent with theories. And by deriving inspiration from population mimetics models in the way cultural elements recombine, or in our model, they converge, we can, in theory, capture the seemingly infinite display of modifications to beliefs during multiple transmissions. But our active inference model doesn't just derive inspiration from mimetics, it also improves on mimetics models by offering solutions, for one, to the hermeneutic problem and to the problem of the site of cultural selection. And finally, we provide a proof of principle for the feasibility of modeling local cultural dynamics of communication with active inference, and we provide a measurable outcome from communication as the convergence between these belief states. And what our results indicate is that agents' ability to listen and to attune to the belief expression of their communicating partner is just limited to basically the extent that they are responsive to sensory evidence from their environment. And now, for our simulations of the global dynamics of a cumulative culture, there were a few changes that we had to make in the model when we moved from the local to these global dynamics, obviously. But a prominent one is that we added a new action, which is meeting selection, as opposed to just the belief expression that we also have in the dyadic simulations. So this is why only in the multi-agent simulations do agents get to choose the agents that they want to meet at each given time point. And this is kind of this is probably like the trickiest part of our simulations. So this is why I have a whole slide just to explain that. And this is a notion that it's been talked about a lot in this conference from the talks that I've heard, this notion of exploitation versus exploration. So specifically what we've done is we thought about agents meeting selection as a preferred location on a grid, where each cell here represents a possible agent to meet. I make a comparison here between what an agent with confirmation bias might look like compared to an agent with novelty bias. And what we see here is that agents have the same exact set of options. First, they have the same amount of possible agents to meet, which is represented as just the cells in the grid. They also have the same amount of agents they have already met. This is represented as the squares that have the numbers on them. And they also have like the same level of similarity that they have with other agents on the grid. And this is represented in the specific values that are shown in the numbers, so 1 to 10. And high values here represent the fact that an agent in this location has high similarity of a belief state with the original agent, and low values represent the opposite. So all these things are the same, but crucially, what agents do differ in is the strategy that they employ for choosing an agent to meet. And this results in different choices over 3 time steps. Each choice they make is highlighted in dark gray, and you see that we have 3 gray spots here. So what are these different strategies, and how did we incorporate those into an active inference framework? So in active inference, action selection is guided by the expected free energy. And like we already mentioned, this entails maximizing the expected benefit or utility of an action. And this is known as pragmatic value in the literature. But it also entails maximizing the potential information gain of future action. This is known as epistemic value. And I think these constraints to free energy minimization would be best understood as formalizing, like I said, the exploration and the exploitation trade-off that we see often in different learning systems. So epistemic value can be compared with exploration, that is referring to the benefit that is related to searching over a whole sample space in order to get a better estimation of promising areas that will then be able to be maximized with pragmatic value. Pragmatic value being compared with exploitation. And a crucial point to understand is that agents with different preferences here, so novelty bias or confirmation bias, they don't differ in their ultimate goal, which is their ultimate shared goal is to meet similar agents to them, and with this to reduce uncertainty about the agents that they're going to meet, about their behavior. So our agents just differ in the strategy that they employ for reaching this goal. And when agents have confirmation bias, they're biased towards maximizing this expected utility and increasing the chances of properly synchronizing with this agent. And this is why this type of agent will choose to go and meet agents he has already met that he knows have high similarity values. On the other hand, agents with high novelty bias would prefer to maximize information gain by exploring the state space. And what this gives them is the chance to reduce ambiguity about their future decisions. So this type of agent would want to go to agents that are extremely similar, but it would be willing to sacrifice a little bit of temporary discomfort of exploring the field, so to speak, to see if perhaps there are other agents more suited than those you already met. And this is why the novelty biased agent here will still go and meet again an agent with extreme similarity value 10, but as opposed to the confirmation agent, he would sacrifice the pragmatic utility or the comfort, so to speak, of seeing another agent again, a different agent, in order to gain more information on the state space, which might improve his situation in the long run. So finally, these are the simulations that we made for the global dynamics of cumulative culture. On the y-axis, there's the level of certainty towards a belief state, and on the x is how these beliefs change over time. What we did in this simulation is we introduced a divergent belief state into the population in time step 1 to see how it spreads and how it changes in a population. And what we see is a few cool behaviors. First of all, we see how these results capture cumulative cultural dynamics. So for our first simulations, we had these dyadic simulations, and basically here they're just multiplied. So when they're in communication with another agent, when they converge on a shared narrative, and these simulations, what we show here, they represent this accumulation of the modifications to beliefs within a population of 50 communicating agents. And another cool behavior that we see is that these simulations show how a divergent belief state spreads within a population, and also the effect that this spread has on the population. And what we see here, namely, is that the population here is split into 2. Finally, in the bottom of the slide, we show how novelty bias and confirmation bias modulate the density of agents in each of these groups. So when novelty bias is high in the population, by the end of the simulation, more agents hold the new belief, which is the blue belief, than agents that hold the old or status quo belief, which is in red. But the opposite is true when conformity bias is high in the population. So we explain this result by suggesting that agents with novelty bias are basically the ones that push the population towards accepting to meet an agent with a novel belief. And so without these agents, individuals would be closed to new beliefs and the status quo would just be perpetuated, which is kind of, I think, a cool thing to think about when you think about collective behavior. So this is the conclusion, basically what I just talked about, but there is so we successfully capture the global cumulative culture and the spread of cultural information and what it does to a population. But I do, even though I'm kind of like out of time, I want to discuss, I want to share some thoughts that I've had on a possible theory of innovation that I've been thinking of in relation to the results of our cumulative culture simulations. So in a recent paper from 2016, which, by the way, it was talked about quite heavily in yesterday's talk by Avril, Daniel, and Virginia. I'm not sure if they're here, but anyway. So in this paper, a connection between cumulative culture and innovation is made. The proposal is that under a cumulative cultural network, innovation is interpreted as the emerging property of a complexity of agents, as opposed to the result of the mental effort of one exceptionally skillful individual, like we're kind of used to think about this. So I was thinking a bit about this, and I was wondering how it might be possible to think of and even model innovation in this way. So what I want to do now is share these thoughts with you. So once again, I'm going to make an appeal to biology, because I was thinking about how it might be possible to learn something from the emergence of new species in genetic evolution and use that in our understanding of how novel ideas may emerge through cultural evolution. So genetic spatiation in biology occurs in 3 steps. The first is there's the existence of some population of a species. Secondly, groups of the same species get somehow isolated from one another. And there's multiple ways where this can happen, but we'll leave that abstract for now. And lastly, this isolation encourages the development of each group's own unique characteristic, depending on the constraint of the niche they occupy. So these new characteristics differentiate the 2 population groups, and these differences then grow larger and larger as the 2 groups reproduce separately due to their separate environments. Ultimately, across generation, genetic differences between the old and the new group become so large that they're no longer able to create offspring, which is when they are considered to be separate species. So a classic example is that of the Galapagos finch, where over time, there's like different species of this bird inhabit different locations, different islands in the Galapagos. And over time, these different groups developed different beaks. So one group, they were very thin and long, because those were ideal for probing cactuses. And other finches developed large and blunt beaks, which were good for nut cracking. And due to this reproductive isolation of being on different islands, they developed into separate species with their own unique genetic features. Sorry. And consequently, were unable to create offspring. So my point here in this slide is that a model of spatiation could be applied to the way new beliefs emerge in culture. And to make this a bit easier to grasp, I'll give a specific example from the world of religion to show what I mean, and hopefully I'm not going to offend anybody. In the case of Christianity, for instance, early Christians were separated from other members of their original Jewish group on the basis of a unique interpretation of Jewish scripture. So according to Jewish scripture, the concept of the Messiah refers to a Jewish king who will rule the Jewish people and save them from their enemies. And according to the interpretation of early Christians for the idea of a Messiah, Jesus was this Messiah and was declared to be the Son of God. But the problem was that the Messiah, according to Jewish beliefs, is not considered to be a god, but merely like a very charismatic leader of Jewish people. So these two divergent representations of what exactly is denoted in the concept of the Messiah isolated the different groups within the Jewish population. So across generations, these differences became so large that the separate streams developed their own unique set of characteristics, traditions, beliefs, and followers, and a new religion, which was Christianity, emerged. So what I was wondering about is if we wanted to simulate this process of innovation as cultural spatiation under active inference, what would be the conditions for its emergence? So I've thought about it, and the first one would be isolation. We would have to quantify the divergence that occurs in the population due to the introduction of a divergent belief state. Secondly, spatiation. We would have to quantify this convergence of individuals within the groups. And we would explain that, I think, as a collective free energy minimization under the active inference framework. But lastly, and this is the most important point, you would need a novel belief state that naturally emerges from these dynamics. So as I've mentioned in the beginning, that the process underlying cultural dynamics is a circular one, where each process naturally emerges from the last. So to capture those circular dynamics, we would need to think of a new paradigm for simulating the natural emergence of a sufficiently divergent belief state. So I say sufficiently divergent because it needs to be dissimilar to the status quo belief to a degree that is large enough that it creates a certain level of isolation between the different belief groups, or in other words, it needs to make sure that each group maintains its integrity. But the difference between the novel belief state and the status quo also can't be too large, because then communication with the first agent holding this belief becomes completely impossible. And note that this latter condition is simply the assumption in active inference for the mere possibility of communication, namely that for agents to arrive at a hermeneutics resolution and to be able to understand each other, they must employ sufficiently similar generative models. So it would be cool if you could find a way to create the Goldilocks conditions for a belief state to emerge naturally from the dynamics of a cumulative culture that we have shown here. If this is computationally possible, then we might be able to close the circular process of cultural dynamics and show that the spread of information brings about actual changes to cultural information that with time and with multiple generations of transmission create divergent traits that create new cultures and beliefs, which spread through a population again in a way that perpetuates this evolution of culture. And yeah, that's it. So thank you very much. And I hope you enjoyed it.